I read this week about the 19th century philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, who drew a very stark portrait of the fate of the human race. He compared us to a bunch of porcupines huddling together on a cold winter's night. He said, the colder it gets outside, the more we huddle together for warmth. But the closer we get to one another, the more we hurt each other with our quills. And in the lonely night of the earth's winter, eventually we begin to drift apart and wander out on our own and freeze to death in our loneliness. What a powerfully sad image. And the saddest thing about it is that all too often, it's all too true. We draw together for comfort. We prick each other and then we pull away into loneliness. In everything from international politics to backyard bickering, over and over again, we see this sad scenario come true. I know 6 or 8 weeks ago, it seemed like my news feed was filled with these positive, heartwarming stories of folks lining up to cheer on medical workers, and stories of folks spending their whole days sewing masks to give away to people in need. People were checking in on their neighbors and emailing me, asking what more they could do to help the community. Now I've had to avoid Facebook and limit my time reading the news, because it feels like lately we're more prone to hurting one another with our quills. I see fights over when to open up, how to open up, whether to open up. Fights pitting individual freedom against our responsibility to the wider community, as though it's an either-or proposition and we only get to have one, so we better get in our camps and resist the other. People who I love and care about are verbally attacking each other, and those quill pricks hurt. I sometimes start to think that grumpy old Schopenhauer was right. But then we hear these words from Jesus. The Father will give you an advocate. The Spirit abides with you. Because I live, you will live. My Father loves. I will love. You love. Somehow Jesus has this way of breaking down our downward spiral of hate and destruction and calling us to a new cycle, a new relationship of love. Jesus stops the prickly poking and points us to a peaceful kingdom, a beloved community, a circle of hope and presence and promise. And we have to remember what was going on here in these words from Jesus. This section of John is part of Jesus' farewell discourse. He has just washed the disciples' feet and given them the commandment to love one another. And he has just foretold Judas's betrayal and Simon Peter's denial. He was trying to draw them together, but already those pricks of sin and evil were driving them apart. Things were intense when he started talking, telling them he wasn't going to be with them much longer. They must have been so confused and unsettled. They'd had this intimate experience of love and care, and then the specter of betrayal and denial hovering over them all. How could they possibly understand what was about to happen to Jesus, what was about to happen to them? Or even why he was telling them these things now. But they'd soon find out that he was right. Everything was about to change. The way they shared their life of faith was about to be turned completely upside down, and it would never be the same again. Jesus was not going to be together with them in the same way. After his crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension, he would not be there with them as he had been for the past 3 years. So Jesus says, listen, very soon we are not going to be physically present with one another. But don't worry. Just because we're not physically present with one another doesn't mean you have to do this thing alone. the Father will give you another advocate to be with you forever. It's interesting here because when Jesus talks about another advocate, there's actually two different words in Greek that mean another. There's the word allos, which means more of the same, and then there's heteros, which means more of another of a different kind. And the word here that Jesus uses is allos, another of the same kind. It's like if you're at a restaurant and the waitress comes up and says, "Would you like another iced tea?" You know that she means another of the same kind, a refill, as opposed to her saying, "Would you like another drink?" A different one like Coke or Sprite. So the Greek word that's used here to describe the advocate is allos, another of the same kind, which emphasizes that the Spirit that God the Father is sending is the very Spirit of Jesus, not a different one. Jesus' love and grace and healing and power and call to radical love and service and sacrifice will all still come to you through this advocate. "I will not leave you orphaned," Jesus continues. Now, back in those days, there were a number of traveling teachers and preachers. And often when a teacher would leave town, the disciples without a master would be referred to as orphans. So Jesus is saying, "I'm leaving, but you're not going to be without a master. I will still be your leader." And the idea of a group of disciples continuing to call themselves disciples to someone who had been crucified, that was unheard of. They would normally want to distance themselves from their former leader because he's gone now. But Jesus is saying, no, you will still be able to follow me through the advocate. So let's talk about this advocate, this Spirit of truth that abides with them. Lutherans admittedly aren't the best at having a well-developed understanding of the Holy Spirit, but John gives us this beautiful image of the Spirit here. In Greek, the word is paraclete, not like paracletes, like my son's baseball shoes, and not parakeet, like the bird, right? Paraclete. In our translation, it's translated advocate, but it could also be translated as helper, encourager, counselor, comforter, or companion. And each of those words, each of those translations give us a slightly different facet of how John envisions the Spirit's work in our lives. And all of them are things that we probably would be quite open to having in our lives right now, right? Paraclete literally means to stand beside. So we use the word advocate, sort of a courtroom image of having someone up there with us to stand up for us. A counselor gives us advice. An encourager keeps us going. And a comforter, well, that reminds me of the comforts our ladies sew at church, that you can wrap yourself in and know that God is there with you. And then, of course, a companion means that we are not alone, no matter how prickly the other people in our lives are or how distant we may be from them. And Jesus tells us that the Paraclete abides with us and indeed in us, drawing us into this circle of love between the Father and the Son and the Spirit that we get to be a part of. It doesn't necessarily protect us from the prickles of the world, but it does give us the assurance that the world's cold and prickly winter of loneliness and division is not ultimately what our life together is about. I find this to be incredibly helpful during this particular season of our lives, when it feels like everything is changing in ways we can't fully understand yet, where we cannot be physically present with one another in the ways that we have been, when it feels like our whole way of doing faith together has been turned upside down. But But just because we're not physically present with one another doesn't mean we have to go through this alone. What has kept us together through this time? It hasn't been Zoom or Facebook or YouTube, as helpful as those technologies are. What keeps us connected is something deeper than any of our technology. We are still bound by love through this advocate, helper, encourager. God has been and will continue to be our companion through this time. Just as the disciples couldn't have imagined continuing to follow a crucified leader, it's hard for us to imagine still being the church if we aren't gathering together. And yet, here we are. That's exactly what we've been doing. We're obviously still trying to figure out how this all works and how we move forward to gathering again safely, which may be further down the road than any of us want it to be. But it took the disciples a long time to figure those things out too. In fact, we as Jesus' disciples are still trying to figure it out, right? But we can trust that because of Jesus, because of the gift of the Spirit, we can be drawn into relationship and community that's characterized by forgiveness and love and care for one another. Because Jesus lives, we will live also in this intimacy of being in God and God being in us. So as we continue through this time at home, if you start to feel discouraged or overwhelmed by the ways in which people hurt us and hurt each other with their quills, well, I invite you to defy Schopenhauer. Instead of withdrawing into cold loneliness, reach out to find the warmth of God's love there for you in a phone call to a friend or a note written to someone who lives alone. Reach out to find the warmth of God's love as you share a story of where you've seen God at work in the world, pointing out the Holy Spirit's movement in our midst. Reach out to find the warmth of God's love through a donation to Second Home or the Free Clinic or the Food Bank or another organization who is serving the most vulnerable among us. Reach out to feel the warmth of God's love through a time of prayer for all those who are trying to make tough decisions that impact others in this uncertain time. Reach out for a hug for that person that you're quarantining with and you are so tired of being around, but who you really do love. In all these things, we experience the keeping of Jesus' commandments as Jesus is revealed to us and in us and through us. This is a crazy time, but we are not alone. God is with us, and God will love us forever.